Hello, and welcome back to the Performance Marketing Unlocked podcast. It is a grand return to our traditional format today. We've got, joining me at the beginning of the episode, PMW's premium content editor, Jyoti Rambai, to talk about, well, some of PMW's premium content. The world of agencies and mergers and acquisitions. It's been a flurry of news since the back end of last year and the beginning of 2025. And Jyoti and I break down some of the big changes, some of the buyouts, some of the mergers, some of the acquisitions. And we point you in the direction of our newest investigative series on PMW, 3 Tough Questions, all of which is now on the website. And the first edition of the series dives into mega agencies and holdcos. I hope that you will all enjoy. Following my chat with Jyoti, I'm joined by Wayne Butler, Head of Media Effectiveness at Sky Media, and Nigel Walley, the CEO at Decipher, to talk about whether or not CTV, digital, online, streaming, all these common phrases in the world of advertising are complete buzzwords and shouldn't exist at all. It's a hot take, but these two industry veterans have been around a while, and you may be surprised and shocked to hear their thoughts on why the industry's language has made measurement and data unnecessarily complicated. Fortunately, they have some solutions and some guidance for you all to action to help overcome the challenges that they've identified after spending years and years in the industry specifically focused on TV and media. So look forward to that discussion. With all that said, it is time to sit back, relax, and enjoy this episode of the Performance Marketing Unlocked podcast. Jyoti Rambai, hello. Welcome back to the Performance Marketing Unlocked studio. How are you doing?
Not too bad, thanks, Joe. It's nice to be back. It's a nice day outside. I feel like spring is finally here.
Unseasonably warm, I would say. It's getting up to 19 degrees supposedly here in London.
Yeah, I regret bringing my winter coat in today.
I was speaking with it to my partner about this morning, actually. She left the house in shorts for the first time in months,
Oh, really?
Whereas I still had my gloves with me, and it just shows the distrust I have for the British weather, whereas she's a seasoned Southwest Londoner, so is very familiar with taking advantage of the nice days when they come. But yeah, we're enjoying the sunshine, that's for sure. We're here today, though, to talk about, since the beginning of 2025, a lot of news has happened that's been drawing our attention to many different things, but something that's been percolating under the surface, but has really come to the forefront in recent weeks, is the agency landscape and the way that it's changing. Now, since the beginning of the year, there's been a lot happening on the mergers and acquisitions front. As our correspondent who takes care of our M&A roundup, why don't you enlighten our listeners as to exactly what's been happening since the beginning of the year?
It's interesting you say that, and yeah, the M&A market's been quite ripe since the beginning of this year, but actually I would say it started to pick up at the end of last year, and I've got some figures here. So generally, this is at a global level, M&A activity picked up about 12% in the second half of 2024. And I think UK was probably one of the ones that saw a big surge. And there were some big moves. And I know one of them obviously is the Omnicom IPG one. And I know we'll talk about that in a little while in a bit more detail. But yeah, I think there was a bit of a downturn, maybe 2023, beginning 2024. And, we were in economic uncertainty. Private equity investment sort of funds had sort of, I wouldn't say dried up, but people were a bit more hesitant about where to invest. And I think that's changing. And that's why we're seeing a lot of the M&A activities surge.
Have you got an inkling as to why the change has happened? Because I wouldn't say economically, at least, things have stabilized particularly. Is it just that people have been fed up with laying in wait and are deciding to take some more risks?
I don't know, but I think last year, definitely first half of the year, we were still recovering from the cost of living crisis. Inflation was still high. And not to mention then, from a political side, there were so many different major elections happening around the world. We had one in the UK, the US, India, some of the big markets. So naturally, marketers were a little bit hesitant. Investors were a little bit hesitant. They wanted to see what would happen on that side before they invested.
Yeah, so the changing factor there really is now we know which administrations are in place where, by and large, for the most part, with those elections having taken place. And it seems as if that factor is good enough for people to go on ahead and start making some moves, albeit with inflation, particularly here in the UK, still sort of stubbornly high. There's threats of stagflation, and politically, I don't know whether or not things are more or less turbulent than they were ahead of those elections. But talk us through some of the big mergers and acquisitions that have happened in that time since the back end of last year and the beginning of this one.
I'll talk about the key ones from this year, right? So we've had like Stagwell, that's acquired the ADK Global. Then we've had Ryan Reynolds is buying back his agency, Maximum Effort Marketing, from MNTN. So that's another big one and quite a nice one.
Your friend Ryan Reynolds from HubSpot in Boston last year.
Yeah, well, I had to give him a name drop. We've had a lot of partnerships as well. So last week, Scope 3 reimagining its platform with AI, agentic AI. So we've had Telegraph Media Group partner with them, Ubiquity, and there's a few others that are partnering with them.
So there's been a lot happening and there's a lot of moves, and we'll direct the listeners to our mergers and acquisitions roundup to look at any of those previous ones in more detail. But the one you've touched on there, I wanted to dive into here, being Scope 3.
Yeah.
The move into agentic AI in a sort of, they're trying to marry sustainability and AI together as best they can, which are quite challenging things to do, we're finding, but they did their big release last week, and off the back of that, there's been a ton of partnerships with Scope 3. It seems my inbox is constantly flooded at the moment with more and more Scope 3 partnerships from a lot of ad techs.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people are seeing this move from them as a real positive, and they are getting on the back of it. Like, I don't personally know too much about agentic AI other than that it's probably one of the solutions that is coming through as the way forward in this open web cookieless landscape.
Yeah, it's a bit of a buzzword, but it's something that we've got to get familiar with quickly.
Yeah.
But the idea of agentic AI, it's AI that requires less human interaction for it to learn. It can change and it can communicate with other AI systems and sort of develop itself, I suppose. And the big move from Scope 3 is not only getting into the agentic AI space with its technology, but also doing it in a fashion that's environmentally sustainable, which is obviously one of the big knocks against AI. Now, this is all very nascent technology, so we'll have to see if it works as has been built, but it's a very exciting prospect nonetheless, and it seems to be winning a lot of potential partners over.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see how this space, evolves, especially on the sustainability front, because that's been another talking point, and it's come up again recently. We've gone through the phase of, everyone's getting on it, let's cut back how we're using, wooden spoons and plastic in the offices, versus now we saw the rise of AI, and now the talks back about the emissions and, how to reduce your carbon footprint.
Your digital footprint in particular.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's interesting, I suppose. And agentic AI, as I said, big buzzword, difficult one to understand, incredibly fluid definition of exactly what it is as well. That's for the experts to debate and decide. But yeah, the Scope 3 news of last week was certainly a big one, and there's been a lot of subsequent partnerships in lieu of that. Another big one, which we touched on at the beginning, and we can get into more detail now, was this came out, we're recording this Thursday, the 20th of March. This will come out next week. But earlier this week, we had the big IPG Omnicom merger.
Yeah, so the latest update on that is that the shareholders of both companies have agreed the merger. Omnicom will acquire roughly a 60% stake in IPG. So IPG shareholders will maintain about a 39% share. So I guess this is really happening now.
Yeah, break down for our audience exactly what this means. Why do we think this merger has happened, and what are the ramifications?
Okay, if we take it back a few steps, right? So, and this relates back to a new series that we've just launched called Three Tough Questions. And one of the first things we're looking at is the agency landscape. And
specifically mega agencies and holdcos.
Yeah, and the holdcos. We've known for some time that the dynamics are shifting, and one of the things is around other entrants into the ecosystem, so big tech and a lot of brands going directly to those techs to buy inventory.
Independent agencies as well.
And the rise of independent agencies getting bigger to a level that they can compete with the holdcos, whereas traditionally they, as someone put, being gobbled up by the holdcos. And then you've got the rise of consultancies coming into the mix with their own advertising. So this has sort of disrupted the ecosystem a little bit.
It certainly puts some additional pressure on holdcos to respond. And holding companies and these big mega agencies, often because of their size, they're somewhat restricted to respond fluidly to changing market factors. Certainly, they're a little bit more restricted in comparison to independents, ad tech companies, and these consultancies that you mentioned. So this IPG Omnicom merger is somewhat their hands have been forced a little bit by the changing ecosystem.
And part of that is because if you think about what the traditional holding company looked like, you had your creative side, then you had your media side, and it was very much siloed. That's all changing as well. We've got a lot of them with the use of AI, that's all converging. Then you've got everyone's looking at data. Data is the new thing, right? Now, if we take a look at Publicis Group, which arguably has been leading the way in terms of market capitalization, they've, over the last 10 years, they've bought their sort of investment in mergers and acquisition has been huge. I think it's something like 10 billion euros. I can double check that, but that's how much they've invested, and a lot of it is in data. So they acquired Epsilon, they had Sapient. We're talking over the last 10 years. And then you've got more recently Loctamine, and some of these are also influencer agencies or digital or direct marketing companies. So I think Disrupt is another one that they acquired that this year. So their mergers and acquisitions strategy has been quite successful. Omnicom and IPG has, part of the reason they're coming together is to actually compete against like a Publicis. So I think Omnicom acquired Flywheel
not that long ago.
And then IPG has Axicom. So that's it. But they're not sort of, I would say, in the same as Epsilon, but in order to compete, they're finding themselves having to come together to then, and if it is successful, they would actually be leading the pack and they would have a bigger capitalization market.
So it's a pooling of resources to maintain competition with the likes of Publicis Group and within the big mega agencies, but it's been imposed on them, let's say, because of the changing landscape. And it's a very complex topic to dive into, isn't it? And I suppose you mentioned there Three Tough Questions, PMW's new investigative series. Both you and I have contributed to this first question that we're seeking out to answer, which is these first series of questions, I should say, which is 3 tough questions on mega agencies. And all 3 parts are now available for PMW subscribers to read. But the goal of this series is to bring a little bit more transparency to this changing landscape, because there's a lot going on, there's a lot to digest. There's a lot of rumours about what might happen in the future too. I know WPP has been selling off elements of Kantar, and there's rumours about a breakup there. We can't confirm anything, but there's been whispers.
But yeah, so just to put it into context, like WPP saw its organic growth and net revenue fall by 1% to, I think their net revenue is about £11.4 billion. And when you compare that to, say, Publicis, it increased its organic net revenue by about 5.8% to 13.96 billion euros. I mean, that's a big difference, right? And yeah, so with WPP, there's a few rumours, as you mentioned, and people saying that it could fall victim to private equity investment. And if that happens, then there is a chance that investors might want to break up the agency.
We'll have to wait and see, but this first series of 3 tough questions, and we can enlighten our listeners a little bit as to what they can expect reading it and what they can learn, because it will answer a lot of the questions that arise from this discussion here. But do you want to give your quick elevator pitch, Jyoti, as to the question that you sought out to answer? That was part 1 of this series.
Yes. So, all right. So the question I posed was, is Adland becoming a 2-tier industry? Now, there's arguments for and against that. One of them was it's already a 2-tier structure and has already been a 2-tier structure. But that now is becoming more integrated. The other argument is that all these other players that I've said have disrupted the ecosystem is no longer a 2-tier structure, but it's more of a spectrum with the holding companies, big tech, ad techs, consultancies, all somewhere, and the independents all within that spectrum. It'll be interesting to see what everyone else thinks, because I'm assuming everyone's got a slightly different take on what this should be, but it's no longer 2 tiers, I would say. That's my opinion.
Well, and you conducted some very interesting discussions that led you to that conclusion, but I direct our listeners to the piece to gain a little bit more insight as to why you've landed at that conclusion and some of the discussions you had with a lot of very leading industry experts. And that, of course, led into the question I sought out to answer, which was, are holdcos on a collision course with ad techs? Because these billion-dollar companies, these holding companies worth billions of dollars, are in some cases being dwarfed in terms of their valuation by some of the bigger ad tech players. You've got some smaller ones that are growing, like Magnite, for example, that's worth only a couple of £1 billion, but the likes of the Trade Desk and AppLovin in particular, AppLovin's worth over £100 billion. This is per Google Finance. So that's dwarfing even the likes of Publicis. And what I've really wanted to dig into there is I had conversations with a series of experts into whether or not the 2 big ad tech holding companies, can they coexist? Can they work together? Or are their interests too conflicted? You'll have to go on and read that, which is available now on the website. And the third and final part is brought together by our editor, Robin Langford. And the question he sought out to ask is pay for performance the future of agency fees? And he sort of unpacks, why would you pay agency fees up front when you can just pay for performance after the fact, and whether or not this is the norm.
Yeah, and that one in particular is looking at whether we should move to a results-based payments model. It's an interesting question. It would be interesting to see what people think about whether that should be the way forward or whether we need a whole new payment model for the industry.
I don't want to seem like I'm plugging us too much, but all of these made for very interesting reads, and they were certainly, it was a lot of investigating on our parts, and we were digging into these for months in the end. But what has come to fruition as a result of those discussions and interviews and conversations and what's been published, it is really interesting and it's fascinating, and there's only going to be more coming in the future, certainly when we talk about the agency landscape. So Jyoti, thank you very much for joining us to chat all things M&A and our new series, 3 Tough Questions, the first one being all about mega agencies. Thank you, Jyoti, for joining me.
Thanks, Joe.
Wayne Butler and Nigel Walley, hello and welcome to the Performance Marketing Unlocked studio. How are you both doing?
Good, thank you.
Yeah,
thanks for the invite.
Great to be here.
It's a lovely sunny day, we were saying off air. You don't get them very often here, but we appreciate you making the journey out to Twickenham as well.
Yeah, makes a change, doesn't it?
Yeah, shifts everything, doesn't it? Shifts the perspective.
Lifts the spirits.
Already trying to get a little bit of a tan, so I'm getting made fun of less by my siblings back home every time I call them.
Decipher's in Chiswick, so it was a pleasant cycle along the river for me. So.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
And how do you enjoy being out in West London? Do you like it?
Yeah, I've always pioneered this idea that West London is where media innovation is taking place. So I like any stuff going on over here that saves me schlepping up to Shoreditch or the middle of town is brilliant.
Hey,
yeah.
Decipher and PMW were on the same wavelength on that. But we're not here to talk about the weather as much as it's my favourite thing to do, particularly when it's like this. We're here to talk about the industry, Adland in particular, and why the industry's language has made measurement and data when it comes to advertising feel unnecessarily complicated. And this is the topic that I know the pair of you have been discussing at length for a little bit of time. So why don't you just give me an introduction to what it is that we're going to be chatting about today?
It's probably fair to say I've been in the TV world for longer than I can remember. I think you'll hear us refer to, so Nigel and I are a little long in the tooth. We've been around, we've seen how the world's evolved. And I think frustratingly, there's a lot of language in the industry at the moment about how complex and how fragmented the industry is. But in reality, when you whittle it down, I actually think it looks very similar today than it did 10, 15 years ago. I think what's really changed is just how we describe it. There've been a lot of entrants in the market in this space. There's a lot of platforms, a lot of tech. Everyone wants to play in this space, and understandably why. There's a lot of money to be got at. It's understandable that when you're a new entrant in this market, you've got to find a way of differentiating yourself, standing out from the crowd. And the way I think that the industry has largely addressed that problem is to relabel what they do, sort of carve out a piece of the pie, package it up slightly differently, give it a different name, and then try and sell it as something new and interesting. When in reality, it's the same thing, it's the same pie. They've just recategorized it. And it's got to the point now where there are terms used in the industry, and as an expert, people come to me as an expert and say, what is this? So we'll talk about CTV. What is CTV? I'm still trying to figure that one out, if I'm honest. And I think we're compounding the problem rather than trying to simplify. So I think we've got to recognize as an industry that how you talk about something, the language, is probably as important as the tech, the capabilities, the data, all of the stuff that everyone's interested in talking about. And if we're not going to talk about it in a consistent way, then we're just propagating this problem. It's apples and pears. In fact, we're not even in the same genre. It's apples and dogs. Nigel and I think, are very much aligned on this. And I think Nigel does a very good job of sort of describing the challenge we have and underpinning it. But for me, that's the sort of industry problem we face.
Okay, well then maybe Nigel, I'll turn to you and talk to us more specifically about those challenges and maybe narrow the scope a bit. Yeah. Specifically, what are we talking about? Who are we talking about? Are we talking about advertisers? Are we talking about specifically media? What are the challenges that we're facing?
Yeah, so the challenges that Wayne and I have been kind of addressing are really video-centric. So it's television in its broadest definition. So we come from the old television world that had a reasonably narrow definition. It was broadcast television was a thing that everybody could look at and point at and know what it was. But I think there's a kind of a two tribes issue going on here. We've had television itself going through the problem of digitizing over the last 15 years. And over on the sidelines, we've had the internet media emerge, initially just as display. A whole complex industry has grown up with its own buzzwords, jargon, descriptions, measurement techniques. And very slowly, those two worlds have come together. As video has jumped from broadcast and television, the television environment over onto the internet, we've had two worlds sharing a medium. And so you get this kind of two tribes thing where two different parts of the industry are describing something which to us looks like the same thing, but with different words, different descriptions, and trying to push different measurement techniques and valuations onto the media agency. And so a lot of the time in the last few months, we've been addressing media agencies, talking about who walks in the door and tries to sell them something. and what are they calling it, and how are they defining it, and how are they measuring it, and isn't it the same, and the kind of questions that should be pushed back. And we've been trying to amass a list of buzzwords that should be removed from the industry, and I'm very self-conscious sitting here that if I use one of these words mistakenly in conversation, by the time I next meet my eldest son who works in performance marketing up in town, he will nail me for using it. But we've been talking about phrases like CTV. I don't even like the word digital, it must be said. I try, very rarely use it potentially as an adjective, never as a noun. Words like online, CTV, all of these kind of things make no sense to us because they don't describe something. And we have just recently kind of narrowed the whole of the video world down to two formats. There's linear television, there's on-demand television. Everything else is a buzzword that someone's pushing because for their own commercial benefit.
This is a hugely hot take, I must say. And when it comes to connected TV, online, digital, Wayne, you mentioned fragmentation earlier. They're words I'm all guilty of using pretty much on a daily basis. And I know CTV in particular, that's performance marketers, as your son, you said. Wait, Nigel, we use those terms all the time, and they're some of our favourite terms. So why don't you give us the laundry list of the buzzword terminology and break down exactly why you don't think they need to exist? Why are they overcomplicating things?
Well, should we pick them off one at a time?
I was going to say, let's get digital off the table.
Let's start.
That's like saying electric.
Digital's a good one.
I work in electric marketing. What do you mean? Well, all of our marketing uses electricity. Well, that's great. You wouldn't say that. It's insane. But people say, I work in digital marketing. And you think, well, what's analog? Why are you using the word digital to describe everything? And it's one of those words that actually you can just cut it out. And we do a thing where if we're doing a presentation to an audience of agency people, we say, who's got the word digital on their business card? And it's just like, strike it off. It means nothing. So digital is the first one that should be off the table. It's done its time, like electric. And if you haven't got an electric agency, you don't need a digital agency.
Yeah, and I think a close second is CTV. I mean, find me a television that isn't connected. The television is just the means by which you watch the content. But somehow we've conflated this idea that CTV is a distinctive thing and it's different to other forms of TV. Now in Sky, that's really frustrating because, we don't hear people come to us and say, PlayStation. You can watch the same content on your PlayStation as you can on your connected TV. Essentially, it just requires an internet connection. We were in a closed session with a bunch of experts around the industry, people who've been in TV, measurement, tech for some time. And this idea of connected TV came up. And I sort of put my hand up and said, before we start, can I just ask you what you mean by connected TV? There were 13 of us in the room, all representing different parts of the business. And none of us could come up with a consensus on what we mean by connected TV. So it's become everything to anyone. It's one of those things that you can use to justify a position, but someone else can repackage it up, use the same term and promote something different. Now at Sky, we deliver content on a set-top box. We deliver content on a connected TV. By my definition, a TV you've plugged into the internet. We deliver content via a puck, a little box, which we call Sky Stream. We could deliver content on an iPad. Those are all just the ways in which you consume the content. But somehow we're trying to push that upstream as it's something you buy. And I've started to sort of think, and I think I've got to the sort of under the skin of what the implications of connected TV are. It's very much a concept that's come over from the States. Yeah, it didn't start here, and when you put it in the context of the US, it makes a little bit more sense. But in reality, the US trades TV in such a different way. They consume content in a very different way, and to suggest that is a term that belongs in the UK TV advertising market, it just absolutely doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And it's the problem is that so many agencies and media clients sit in companies that are owned by American corporations. So this stuff bleeds over from head office. And as Wayne says, in America, for a long time, the television market was plagued by set-top boxes of very poor quality. Cable TV across the mass of America was dreadful. the boxes were bad, the menus were bad. They weren't really properly digital. And then internet connected televisions came along, and you had this real disparity between cable TV and what they were calling connected TV, which was really just smart televisions connected to the internet. So you saw that for a while in America, you could define CTV as a new kind of television centered around these smart screens. But that never made sense over here because we had set-top boxes, not just Sky, all the cable boxes, Freeview boxes, all TV devices were always connected to the internet. And so when that buzzword got dragged over to the UK, it made no sense unless you were one of these big American corporates trying to flog the same package that they're flogging in the States across European markets. And we kind of know what it is they're trying to flog. It's what I would call second-tier media on apps sitting on smart televisions. That they may have a different description for it, but that's kind of what it is. When you look at who's selling it and who's pushing the phrase CTV, it's what Wayne said right at the beginning. It's a group of people who are reasonably late to the market with a tech-centric proposition who are trying to define a little area of media that they can own and control by giving it this sexy name and then sponsoring conferences. And so, you get these, we're having a CTV conference and your heart sinks. Oh, God almighty. Can anyone actually define CTV? You should have it on the door. You're not allowed in this conference unless you've got a good definition of CTV. And so it perpetuates itself. But actually, as we were saying, you come down to the fact there's live telly and there's on-demand telly. And the rest is just details.
But it's even more frustrating than that. So I went to one of those conferences that you alluded to. And one of the headlines is, from a CTV provider, linear is dead.
Yeah.
And what was really interesting is because when you look at the numbers, almost 80% of the content delivered on a CTV is linear. But somehow linear is dead and CTV is the way forward. It just absolutely makes no sense.
If I were to play devil's advocate here, just for the sake of doing so, representing
to stop us agreeing
the
mercilessly
marketers here, I'd say I would define CTV as anything that's online. So whether that be your a television like we've got here on studio that's connected to the internet, or it can go across anywhere that you can stream on demand, as we've spoken to here. So an element of CTV in many respects would be, say, you're watching something from your phone or another internet-connected device that you can then stream from. Now, the reason I want to dig deeper into why CTV is a buzzword, perhaps it is a buzzword because the scope of what it encompasses, like performance marketing, for example, is a little bit broad. It's a little bit fluid. I often ask people, can you define performance marketing? And I'll get a different definition. And you might say, can you define CTV?
And you said streaming twice. We're going to come to that one as well. Yeah.
And
in fact, everything you're saying, I'm making notes
and
here.
you get a different definition. But to me, CTV is just something that's connected to the internet versus something that's not.
Can you tell us which devices I can see video that aren't connected to the internet?
That aren't connected to a linear TV that doesn't have internet accessibility.
Right. Do you know anyone who's got one of those?
My grandparents.
Yeah, okay.
And I would say they're definitely getting pushed out of the market. You see them far more infrequently. But these CTV providers, the scope of what a device provides, I guess that differs. But where's the problem with using that language? That's what I want to dig into. Are we now getting conflicting? Well, you've said conflicting agendas. You've made that clear for sure. But what about when it comes to measurement, metrics, formats?
Completely.
Is that where it gets murky? Where's the problem, I suppose?
Where do I start? Without trying to get too worked up on this, because I have the tendency to get a bit hot under the collar about this topic. I think you're right. I'm not arguing that CTV has become synonymous with basically OTT, right? If it's internet delivered now, it's CTV.
OTT's on my list as well.
Yeah, I shouldn't use that term, should I? But I'm trying to kind of stay within the realms of where CTV plays. My problem isn't the use of the term CTV per se. It's the inconsistent use of it, and it's so if we could all collectively agree what it is and the role it plays in describing something that we actually trade in the market, I would say brilliant. The problem I have is probably less that there are buzzwords that are confusing, and more that there's an inconsistency of what these things are and mean.
This is where I agree a bit more. The fluidity of a lot of these definitions is frustrating, and I come at it from a journalistic perspective on, more often than not, something might mean another depending on who I'm talking to.
And digital falls into the same trap. There was a digital was clear early on, because digital was a product at one point. But digital has grown in such orders of magnitude now that almost everything sits under digital. And
I refuse to acknowledge the use of digital as a noun, by the way. So you're using an adjective as a noun, and I'm bristling.
So digital today describes too many things to use it in its broadest sense. And I think CTV is the same. There was a time when CTV was quite a specific thing, particularly in the US market, which is where it originated. And somehow it's now just become synonymous with any internet-delivered advertising. And I think we're in a market where you don't buy CTV, you don't buy digital. You buy elements of that, very specific elements, and they have different pricing. And to your point, they're underpinned by different qualities of data, and they have different mechanisms to measure. And when you call it one thing, but it's actually made up of, it's like calling a forest a tree. Every tree is distinct, but suggesting that a tree is the forest because they're the same thing is just ludicrous. And the reason it's a problem is because of the data, because of the measurement and all of those things. So on the one side of the spectrum, you've got the purist who understands the fact that not all of these capabilities that sit under that umbrella term are equal, and recognizes that you've got to chip away at each of those. If I'm going to measure, I can't measure it all in a uniform way. I've got to measure this bit in that way and that bit in this way. And then you've got those that would like you to believe that the most efficient way of measuring an element of it applies to the whole collective. And it's that what I refer to as sort of creative license that gets misused. And for someone who's at the sharp end of the stuff, who is responsible to having to look advertisers in the eye and say, yes, we can measure this stuff with a level of confidence that I'd be ethically prepared to commit to, I cringe when I hear what is out in the market where businesses are saying, we can measure CTV. They can measure 10% of it in a credible way, and 90% of it sort of dilutes as you go up the spectrum.
It muddies the water.
But they are using that 10% to describe the capability for all. And that's the challenge, because without being patronizing, the world of data and measurement is still something that agencies and advertisers are learning. It's not... if you've been in the TV world for 20 or 30 years, this is an area you're probably least comfortable in. It's an element that hasn't been part of the TV ecosystem for a long time. It's not something that people were brought up in, so they don't fully understand the nuance that exists between the quality of data. And it's why when Nigel and I were speaking on this topic a couple of times in the last couple of months, we talk about data and quality alongside this idea of fragmentation and sort of misuse of terms, because that's the key element of this. A connected TV in its true sense, a physical television against the wall with something plugged in, delivers very different quality of data to a set-top box where we have a subscriber relationship with that consumer, and we're collecting everything from that box deterministically rather than having to use ACR technology to scrape the screen. There's just fundamental differences in what underpins what you can buy and the quality of what you're buying, and what you can measure and the quality of that measurement.
Now, this is a very important point that I did want to get into, but I suppose to condense that, it's the ill-defined terms, risks, ill-defined outcomes.
Correct.
If there's no understanding or clarity for what you're looking for, and these metrics are sort of opaque and they change, then the data that you're going to get out from it, the measurement, I suppose, it's going to come out with poor results or inaccurate results. An important thing that you've touched on there, though, is this obsession with data in as opposed to data out. It's something I've spoken about. Is the industry is very obsessed with just gathering data and getting the most data we can, and use of that data and how valuable it is differs a lot, and effective use of data is a bit of an art form, and it's certainly something that some people do better than others. I will grant you that, absolutely.
Who has credible, accurate, triangulated data is one of those questions we've touched on at various points in these sessions. There is, in this world of new entrants with their CTV umbrella, there is a huge amount of kind of inference going on. And one of the things we've been working against is this notion that the new players, they talk with a language of kind of accuracy, which when you scrape the surface, they really don't deliver on. one of the things we've been stressing is that if you're talking about particularly addressability, which is one of those concepts, a function, addressability is a function in marketing that has moved into TV. It wasn't there years ago. If you're going to play around something like addressability, you need accurate data. You need multiple data points on people to be able to address them. Otherwise, all you're doing is you're throwing marketing at blurred and slightly inferred groups of people that you think are who they are, but very often it's hard to prove they are. So we've also been holding up this notion of quality data, as Wayne said, and by quality we mean multiple data points on the same people on the homes, being able to match individuals to homes, being able to match devices to individuals within homes, being able to do that with 3 or 4 data points, not just accounts, but also verified IP addresses. And when you look at the players in the market, the people who can actually do all of those things reduce down to a very small number. And then you have this other crowd who've got apps and are selling media, which they claim under this notion of CTV's accuracy. Actually, what they're doing, as I say, is they're throwing ad campaigns out into blurred groups of data clusters.
Targeting's a big one. I mean, there was a story on the website just last week that was roughly 70% of parents targeted by ads don't actually have children. Mm-hmm. And so it highlights the fact that there are these inconsistencies that do exist. What I want to move on to now, though, is a solution. What's the advice then? If we're going to say that these are the buzzwords, these are what to avoid, here's why it's a problem, what can advertisers do to simplify things and ensure that they're refocusing on quality verified data that drives impact?
The thing I said earlier on about there's only 2 forms of media, linear and on demand.
Here we go.
Is something which actually is kind of one of those metrics that particularly media buyers and agencies and clients should actually have as a starting template. Someone walks in the door and tries to sell you a format with a buzzword next to it. You have to go back and say, actually, one of the things we're going to do, one of the recommendations here is push back and just simplify. What is this thing you're selling me? Is it linear, a live linear outcome? Is it on demand? And if so, what metrics are you using both to target and what metrics are you using to measure? With the linear, there's still a massive industry challenge to understand the difference between some of the concepts that came out of the old TV tribe and concepts that came out of the internet tribe. So I always talk about audiences versus users. In linear TV, we have for years talked about and traded on audiences, which was accurate enough to do the job that particularly big brands wanted to do. But we've never quite resolved whether an audience is just a very large cluster of users. Are those things different? And there's still a big debate, and we haven't really resolved that one. So one of the things we're pushing all the time is to push media agencies to think harder about, are they buying audiences? Are they buying lots of users at the same time? Are those 2 things the same? But media agencies need to go back and push on, is the data they're being offered, is it actually accurate triangulated data or is it inferred data? Is it verifiable, like the IP address that Wayne often uses? There are some companies that actually have access to real IP addresses. There are others that buy in the commercially available ones, which are actually pretty inaccurate on a kind of a monthly cycle. So we're trying to get agencies to step away from the buzzwords, to look at the formats they're buying, and to push very hard on the people walking in the door to sell these things on all of those things, data quality in, data quality used for measurement, etc., and evaluation.
Yeah, I'm going to answer the question slightly differently because it's really just a commercial problem. Ultimately, I think the answer is we just need to make sure that the advertisers are clear what it is they're getting. And then it's up to them to make the decision as to how accurate the answer needs to be. The problem I have is they are being told one thing and being delivered another. And that's the thing I have a problem with. If an agency or an advertiser is aware that they are using a platform that doesn't have perfect data, not that that exists, but is on the sort of less perfect side of the spectrum, and are comfortable that directionally the insights that they're getting from that data is suitable for their needs, then crack on. But if they are being sold this idea that they are getting a very, very clear, definitive view, when the reality is it's very smoke and mirrors behind the scenes. It's all modeled and inferred, and you couldn't actually verifiably audit that what they said they bought or what they said they've measured is accurate. That's the problem I have.
Inference has no place in the world of data.
Correct, and the world of TV advertising is becoming more data centric, and if we're going to accept that, then we've got to understand the principles of what data centricity means. And so the thing I keep saying to agencies and advertisers is, it sounds a bit patronizing, but you need to educate yourself on what it is you're getting. And I kind of say to them, there's simple questions you can ask of any provider that can really start to unpick those things. So where did you get your data? Is it verified? So if someone says, I've got an email address and I can match my email address to your email address, well, where did they get that email address? How do you know that email address actually is real? It belongs to that cohort, that device. IP address matching is becoming massive in the industry at the moment. The reality is, though, IP addresses are not persistent. The IP address you have in your home today will be different from that, in 3 months' time or 6 months' time, because IP addresses cycle. So if you're matching two data sets on IP address, how confident are you that the audience you're trying to match against is the same person that or device or household that belongs to that IP address? And the reason we know this is a problem is because at Sky, we're very fortunate that Sky is also an internet service provider. We have a broadband business. We have access to the underlying data. And what that means is we know what IP addresses belong to a home at any point in time. It's dates and time verified. So if we see an IP address out in market and we want to match that into a Sky home, we can say, did that IP address exist within our broadband infrastructure at that date and time? And if it did, we know with absolute certainty that they are the same device, if you want to keep it, or the same individual home. But we also know how they decay. We can see that the IP addresses are not persistent, and the false positive rate is just significant. And that's just an example. So for me, it's about just shedding light on quality and where it comes from, and advertisers understanding what they're getting. Your targeting point is case in point. If you're targeting an audience, how confident are you? Because if you're going to go through that pain, effort, and pay the premium that comes with targeting, because you can just go and buy all adults on linear TV at a really cheap price, and you're pretty much going to get a significant portion of the population. But if you've decided that, I need to target my campaign at a very specific type or specific household, you need to be confident you're getting that, because you're going to pay a premium for the privilege. Why go through all that effort of planning and money if the reality is that half the audience is actually not who you think? If
you're going to boil down your campaigns to target these niche audiences, you best be sure that they're getting in front of the eyeballs that you want them to be in front
and
of.
The reality is, I hate to say it, but that is generally not the case. There's varying degrees. I'm not saying anyone's outwardly trying to mislead their client, but I think where there is a problem is sort of stopping short on being absolutely transparent.
And these outcomes are quite specific, but a lot of the inputs going in aren't. And I guess that's
exactly
where there really isn't room for a spectrum of what CTV or digital might mean when the outcomes you want to get from the data are really specific. We want this campaign to get in front of these people. And where it either is or it isn't.
Correct, sorry. And where it's becoming really important in this fragmentation world where eyeballs are watching across so many devices, it's becoming increasingly important for agencies and advertisers to try and to link those things together. Advertisers need to know how effective their collective campaign is being, and they want to be able to add all the platforms and all the streaming devices, and sorry to use your favorite buzz term, together in a credible way. So they say, I know confidently I reached X number of homes net, and I'm confident that the responses and the outcomes I got from that investment is Y. The data quality determines how efficiently you do that. And at the moment, coming back to the point around the naming convention, is when you're using broad terms to describe something that is made up of multiple components that all have different levels of data quality and efficiency, I just think it's misleading. And I think it, in some respects, intentionally misleading. And that's the thing that I have a problem with. I think Nigel has a problem with. I don't have a problem with the terms per se. I just think we've got to provide agencies and advertisers with a clarity of what they're getting.
Absolutely, the behaviour. Now, I am conscious of time and we are running out of it. We've got to move on to the Resell Me a Pen challenge. But before we do that, I know we wanted to touch on streaming very briefly. So I'm quite happy to defer to that. We've got 90 seconds on exactly. And I think I can gather why, having had this discussion, it might be a point of contention. But
only because streaming is a word that describes a way of delivering television, but it can cover live linear television. You can stream live television over the internet, and it describes how on demand is being delivered. So actually it comes down to the fact that we were back to there's two kinds of television. Live linear scheduled television, where you get a big audience at the same time and you get all the benefits of synchronicity in your brand impact. And there's on demand. And there's a variety of providers of on demand who deliver it in lots of different ways and measure it in different ways, but they're your two formats. Every single campaign in the UK is going to be made up of a combination of live linear scheduled TV and on-demand TV. And to Wayne's point, what you need to be able to do is make sure that if you use multiple providers of on-demand TV, that they are able to make data sets and targeting that are additive, they use data in the same way, to the same level of accuracy. If you're not, then you're just adding clusters of media players on your media plan just to get the buzzwords on there.
Gents, I feel I've been treated to a discussion from two true industry titans that have been around for a long time, and I've done my best to play devil's advocate where I can, but certainly a lot of the discussion we've had, I think they hit on some pretty significant faults and inefficiencies that do exist within the industry, and discussions like this that bring them to light, call them out, can be really constructive in ensuring that moving forward, because these things are just elements of TV and media and advertising now, they're not going to go anywhere. So we're going to have to work towards refining them and making sure that we are a little bit more
accurate.
Thank you. Exactly. Now, with that said, it is time to move on to the Resell Me a Pen challenge. To refresh the listeners and yourselves on how this works, you've got 60 seconds to resell me an outdated product or service. Can you reveal to me and the listeners what it is you're going to attempt to resell?
So I'll go first. It's Nigel. I'm going to sell you the idea of sending your friends a picture postcard.
A postcard from Nigel. And Wayne, what are you going to resell afterwards?
A magnifying glass as a toy for children.
Amazing. Okay, well, Nigel, we'll start with you. 60 seconds on the clock to resell us the idea of sending your friends a postcard. Your time starts now.
So you're in some nice seaside town. You've gone to see some nice cathedral or a castle or some nice thing, and you pause. The great thing about a picture postcard is it's a way of letting your friends and family know that you paused briefly and thought about them, and you did something that took some moments, some time. You hand wrote something, you stuck a stamp on it. For that moment of time, you were theirs, even though you were away doing something fun and interesting. And that is very hard to recreate in a world of electronic, digital, streamed or on-demand media.
Amazing. 30 seconds on the dot. You've got 30 seconds to spare there. That's one of our quicker pitches. I'm going to reserve feedback until we hear from Nigel. So, Nigel, you've got quite the gauntlet's been thrown down here. Please do go ahead. Wayne, apologies.
That's okay.
Nigel, I'm getting you too confused all day. I think that's the first time I've made that mistake.
That's a hard act to follow.
Wayne, 60 seconds on the clock. Your time starts now.
So if you have a son like mine who spends pretty much the entirety of their free time in front of their PlayStation playing Fortnite, you'll understand what a challenge it is to get your kids out of their house and into the garden. So a couple of weeks ago, I bought my son a magnifying glass and I said, "You're going to have great fun with this." And he obviously looked at me and scoffed at the idea and said, "No bloody way in hell is that going to in any way cross his fingertips." Anyway, cut a long story short, I whipped him out in the garden and I said to him, "Look at this." And we got a log and we harnessed the power of the sun. Can you imagine? And he started carving his name into this piece of wood using the power of the sun. And in the middle of that, I had to take a phone call. I went inside. I forgot about him. Came out 2 hours later. He's still out in the garden. And I thought, what a brilliant way of getting your kids outside. You know, just explore the magic of the garden once again.
Terrific. 50 seconds roughly as well from you. Wayne and Nigel, Nigel and Wayne. Two great pitches, and they hit on one very important element across both of those pitches, and that was creativity. And I think that's a big one that in this world of data and measurement, sometimes people neglect the importance of going that extra mile, making that extra effort. You can't get AI to use a magnifying glass to carve something into a bit of wood for you, nor can you get it to get the grasp the real emotion of putting pen to paper on a postcard to send your friends. So I think those were two great pictures that bring you back out of the world of digital, dare I say, into reality. Two great pictures, a great way to end the show. I appreciate you both for joining me today.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Joe. Nice talking to you.
And that concludes this episode of the Performance Marketing Unlocked podcast. A big thank you to my guest this week, PMW's content editor, Jyoti Rambai, for joining me at the beginning of the show to discuss the ever-changing agency and holding company landscape and give you an introduction to PMW's new investigative series, 3 Tough Questions. Of course, a big thank you to Nigel and Wayne. Wayne and Nigel, only got them mixed up once. I think that's not too bad from me, but the pair of industry titans took us through why a few of the big buzzwords should not exist and really have no place in the industry at all. That was certainly an eye-opening chat for me. I tried to play devil's advocate where I could, but the pair are clearly very well orientated around that discussion, and it's something that myself and I hope you listeners at home will have to ponder and think about in terms of your behavior going forward in the industry. Of course, I would be remiss if I didn't thank you, the loyal listener, for tuning in each and every fortnight as you do. We will be back shortly with our second edition of PMW's sponsored series with Rakuten Advertising, and of course in a fortnight's time with another traditional episode of the Performance Marketing Unlocked podcast. In the meantime, don't forget to subscribe to the show if you haven't already on your podcast platform of choice, and give us some love on social media. We can be found on LinkedIn, TikTok, and YouTube at Performance Marketing World. With all that said, have an amazing week, and you'll be hearing from me again shortly. Bye for now.